connect past with present. Rob Fink, who's our chair of our Heritage Committee, and Charles Thompson as our vice chair of our Heritage Committee, both with Quinn Evans Architects. Very excited to have them here to present. So with that, welcome you guys.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. And as John mentioned, we are going to be talking about capturing history and culture, documenting our built heritage to connect past with present. Now, the title might be a bit of a mouthful, but the concept is actually pretty straightforward. Rob and myself have been working in the preservation and architecture field, myself for a little under a decade, Rob just a bit more than that. But about 8 to 9 years ago, we were approached by a client at a heritage site, this heritage site, in fact, George Washington's Mount Vernon, about creating a BIM that could be used to document the mansion, but not just used to document it in a way to facilitate construction documentation, but in a way that can actually add to the management of the property from a day-to-day operational standpoint, and also from a management of the historical documentation, because they have literally centuries of documentation that they need to keep up with. All right, so for the agenda, just to go very quickly, we're going to tell the narrative of how we actually came up with the process of creating a BIM for this purpose. We're going to be showing examples from several different projects, but primarily you're going to see two shown. The first was Mount Vernon, as we saw on the first slide, and the second is this building, which is the Michigan State Capitol in Lansing. So in the process of going through that story, we're going to talk a little bit about the stewardship challenges that we presented with at the very onset of this. Then we're going to go into the creation of the HBIM, the tool that we actually use to solve or attempt to solve some of these issues. And finally, we're going to conclude with a series of lessons learned about what we figured out along the process and also the changes that have occurred since we have stopped working on this to date. Before we get to that fully, I'll just give a little introduction into the two of us, why we are the people talking to you all about this. As was mentioned, my name is Charles Thompson. I'm a preservation architect based out of the DC office of Quinn Evans. As a preservationist, my profession is rooted in, as you might imagine, history, rooted in the past. But it doesn't mean that the technologies that we use in order to capture information, in order to convey information to their clients, should be. So what I've worked on a lot is integrating newer technologies, emerging technologies, and innovations to help bring preservation into the 21st century and beyond. Rob?
Yeah, I'm Rob Fink. I've been working with Quinn Evans now for over 20 years. I'm an architect by training and by licensure, actually, but in the last, about 5 years or so, I've transitioned to be, I was always the guy that had a knack for technology and was always the CAD guy or the BIM guy that everyone came to. So naturally, when this project presented itself, they came to me and I helped shepherd it through with Charles.
Yeah, great. All right, so to get into the meat of the presentation, starting off with stewardship challenges. Access to and use of accurate and reliable information is crucial for responsible stewardship of cultural resources. Now, this isn't exactly a revolutionary statement when you think about it. We've been living in the information age for much longer than we might anticipate. And in fact, more information is generated now than was when I began the sentence. But one thing to keep in mind, one thing that's very important in this sense, is that first clause, access to and use of reliable information. Because I'm sure there's a lot of people here are aware, just because a client might ask for, let's say, a level LOD 300 BIM level, or a laser scan of a full facility, or photography of this full facility, they might not actually be able to use all that information. And so how do you work with them in order to curate that? And so it's, one, accessible to them in a way that they can actually get it, and then two, they can actually use it for the purpose of managing what their property is, whether that be from a historical perspective or whether that be from operation and maintenance. So going into the cultural sites. Cultural sites can be complex. They might have been built decades or centuries ago, but they were often using tools and methods that are no longer relevant or even known to us some of the time. They can be inaccessible. One of the pictures that's on the top left from my perspective is actually myself on top of a lift on a barge in the middle of a river, because that's the Arlington Memorial Bridge running between Arlington and DC. We needed to survey the condition of the granite balusters, and couldn't use a truck to put a cherry picker over the other side because it still had to be open for vehicular and pedestrian traffic. We also couldn't use drones because if anyone's worked in DC, you can't use drones, especially somewhere as close to the National Airport as this is. And so the only way we can actually get to it to survey was, as I said, on a lift, on a barge, and a river. So not exactly the most accessible place in the world. These sites also can span generations. Oftentimes you'll have craftsmen or people working there that have spent their entire career building up institutional knowledge. And then these people often will retire, or they will change jobs and change venues. And a lot of that knowledge that was built up within that individual is now no longer accessible to whoever the next generation coming in. Finally, they can incorporate unique crafts and techniques. As I was mentioning earlier, a lot of times tools and methods used while these structures and sites were being constructed are no longer relevant to us. Also, a lot of times, these things can be hidden behind a series of subsequent generations of changes. If you look at the bottom left picture, you can see there is an image from the Michigan State Capitol. So the Michigan State Capitol, they love to describe it as having 9.5 acres of decorative paint. And they're not lying. It is a fantastically, beautifully decorated building. But through generations of change and time, a lot of those rooms that were painted very decoratively were covered up for renovations. And you have to peel back layers of paint, peel back layers of history. And so it's just something to keep in mind when you're working in these sites, and something that we needed to keep in mind when creating a tool that our clients could use. So documentation, the documents of themselves. They come in many, many forms. Just on this slide alone, we have on the top a scan of an original historic drawing. If you can't read it out in the audience, that's okay. We couldn't read it in front of us. It's often very illegible. To the left of that, you can see actually a picture of a CAD plan. And on the CAD plan, you might be able to notice a series of individually colored dots. Each of those dots actually represent a different nail from a different time period at the floorboards at Mount Vernon. So these stretch between 1700s, 1800s to the 1900s. And it was important for them to document which nail goes where, because using that information, they can determine how old those floorboards were placed. Then you also have, of course, laser scan and point clouds, and then also a series of reports like HSRs and cultural landscape reports. So these documents, they accumulate over time. They can get lost, they can get shuffled, they can be sectioned away in an archive that not everyone knows where they exist. They come from a variety of sources. Every person is going to generate a new thing, which means that that's a new point of genesis for this document. They often lack context. So sometimes you might have a really nice, let's say, section diagram, but if it doesn't really tell from what period of time in the building's significance it occurred, you might not know how reliable that information being conveyed is. And then they can also rely on impermanent formats. This is something, as we get into more and more digital documentation, you might often find that if you go to a project that was created in a BIM platform, let's say even 20 years ago, it's often hard to get access to that digital information. And of course the same applies to information that was in photographs or negatives or anything that have a certain limited duration of how long they can last. And this information itself, as I just mentioned, it can be lost, it can be unavailable, it can be unclear, and it can be inaccurate. One of the important things I'm going to explain about in this slide is there is a picture in the center of a stringer that has a support for a duct running through it. This is, at Mount Vernon, this is the ceiling above what they call the new room. Now it's new because at Mount Vernon, the period of significance was anything in George Washington's lifetime. So this was new because it was renovated in 1780s? 1785, so yeah, very new, of course. But one important thing to take away is that stringer might seem relatively insignificant, but during this period of time in construction, when they had to make supports and stringers for a suspended ceiling, they would just take scraps of wood that they could find around the property. Now, this particular scrap of wood is actually a molding from a mantelpiece that was installed in the room before it was remodeled. And so this piece of wood predates 1785. I mean, this piece of wood could be up to 300 years old. Now, the HVAC contractor who's going in there to install this duct, they of course didn't know that. So they thought, sure, I see a piece where I can screw in a support, let me do that, go about my business. I mean, this is a pretty significant loss of what could be a culturally significant piece of material to Mount Vernon. And it highlights a very good example of why having a document and a resource that can be used so that you can manage this type of information, so you can manage this type of project to where something very important to the client won't be lost when it's translated to everyday contractors or even people like us, architects coming in. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Rob to talk about design technology.
So over the years, technology has changed a bit. Back in the 90s, this predates me at Quinn Evans, but we did a project where we had to reconstruct the 16-sided barn at the Mount Vernon property. And all we had was this photograph and a scantling, which is also known as a bill of materials from George Washington's time. And so we were able to take a 3D CAD, basically I think we used CAD Vance at the time, and overlaid it on top of the photograph to basically figure out the size of all the materials. So that's some of the early work that we've done. Then we move on to blocking and stacking diagrams. This was all done, again, in CAD. It's very two-dimensional. In order to make it look three-dimensional, we had to basically, manipulate these in 2D space on a drawing. So there's obviously this need to move ourselves into the 3D world. And then back in 2005, we started working in BIM and started to do things three-dimensionally all the time. This is where we did, as a sales pitch, we created a model of the distillery at Mount Vernon, a project that we had done shortly beforehand, and gave an example. Like, there were some areas of the building where we didn't do things by the prescriptive code. We had a variance, and we had a life safety engineer come in and take a look and provide a statement as to why it was okay for us to do something different, and we got sign-off from the local building official. Well, that kind of a document can get lost very simply over the years. So that's what you see there in the upper right. We want to be able to attach that to the building somehow. How would we do that? Through a 3D model. Again, also in the lower right, there's a photograph of the distillery head right there that's part of it. And just, it would be great to be able to pull up this information readily. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the discussion about how we created the BIM. So what is HBIM? We like to think of it as like a 3D filing cabinet. It's essentially, I think we're all now fairly familiar with the term digital twin. It's that same idea where we're going to recreate the building in virtual space. But the way we went about it, we have to make it so that it's useful to the owner. The person that's going to be using it. So there's different strategies about how we model things that I'll go into a little bit more detail of. It's very important to capture spatial data and be able to basically create these elements that can act as these data buckets, we like to call them, or filing cabinets, like folders, where we can then put the information and associate it with it. So our process, we go through collecting of the data, then we have to organize the data after we've collected it. And by the way, the data collection is a constant process. There's the initial push at the beginning of the project where we grab as much as we can, but as we go, we learn that there's new documents and things that we can then use as a reference. We organize the data, then we work on the actual creation of the model. Then we come to the part where we want to make this useful to the owner, so we need to make it, basically integrate it with GIS, so we connect it to the larger system. The building itself has a relationship to the environment around it, the site, and then even beyond the site, the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. Especially Washington's influence is actually felt around the world. So it's possible that we can then, through GIS, connect some of this information globally. And then there's the development of the user interface. The user interface is actually what makes it usable. And if we don't have that, then we notice that we fall short a little bit. So the data collection process, this was, as you can see here, sometimes you find yourselves in some very cramped spaces. As Charles mentioned earlier, it can be really difficult to get to some of these. So we have to be very diligent and be willing to accept data from all different sources, not just a point cloud. We look at historic drawings. We even talk to the stewards of the building themselves to find out stories and other information that we need to take into account. So then next we want to start to deconstruct the building. So this is the Michigan State Capitol. When we were looking at it and deciding how do we want to break apart the different components of the building that are meaningful to the owner so that we can start to track the maintenance of the building itself. So here we just took a regular diagram and on top of a photograph, diagrammed it out to indicate what the different elements were, had the owner review it, they blessed it, then we felt comfortable going forward, doing the actual model creation.
Well, and one thing here that's important to point out is oftentimes we forget that the building itself is an important document for how to treat it, because there's a lot of things that you can see just with your own eyes that are evidence of either generations of change that have occurred, generations of treatments that have been applied, which can significantly alter how the building stands at the time. And then, yeah, just using the building itself as a resource is important.
So once we've got to that point where we know how we're going to deconstruct the building, we can then start to organize the data and add a hierarchy to it. So this was a chart here that's showing how we have the mansion at Mount Vernon, and then within the mansion we have different levels, and then we break the levels down into rooms, and then within the rooms we have different assembly elements such as floors, walls, moldings, so on and so forth. And while we've modeled, this was back in 2014 when we were discussing this, and we weren't yet familiar with USIBD, and we discovered that we needed to qualify what we were modeling because we were working in Revit. Revit doesn't do a good job of representing existing conditions. If a wall is slightly out of plumb, a ceiling is sagging, how do you represent that in the model? Yeah, we could probably go into a program like Rhino, model the heck out of it, and then bring it back into Revit, but by then we would probably use up all the fee on the project. So we had to basically approximate as best we could with the tool that we readily had available. So we came up with this, on the left-hand side there, you can see it says location, shape, material. This was a metric that we used to assign to each model element that then would qualify the accuracy of the location of the object, the shape of the object, and then the material representation of that object within Revit. So very similar to the LOA that USIBD has developed. And then all these resources that we've collected, all the data, not all of it is totally reliable. We actually noticed in some of the documentation that there were conflicts within the documentation. Like one document may say it's like this, the other one says it's like that. So how do we then resolve and decide which one's better? And this is where the owner would come in. So we set up this degree of reliability is what we call this, and it's a 1 through 5, where a 5 is considered most reliable. So something like a point cloud, for the time that the point cloud is captured, that would be a level 5. But some notes taken by an engineer from the 1910s or something that have since been proven to be bunk, that might fall into a level 1. And then so everything else can be somewhere in between. And that can change even over time. As the point cloud matures, like as time progresses, the point cloud becomes less and less reliable over time because it's just a snapshot of what the building was at that time, that point in time when the scan was taken. So the modeling got to be fairly complex. We didn't do it like we would if we were just designing a project that's going to be built. Because we care about the historical context of every piece of the building, we were charged with actually modeling, and you can see here, so on the left-hand side you see the model in its normal state. On the right-hand side you can see where the model is color-coded by date, and you'll notice that the back wall there on the right-hand side is different colors. That's because that's different generations of plasterwork that have been done over the years. And they even wanted to know where we had some plaster patches that were, as small as about 5 inches in diameter. So we actually modeled those there. We went to a really high degree of accuracy with trying to represent the existing conditions. And we did that through not just, again, the point cloud, but through photographs, talking with the preservationists on site, and then all the historic photos that they had. There's lots of documentation.
Yeah, and what this shows here is, for example, Mount Vernon has been working on implementing a new fire suppression system. And so if they have to end up drilling holes through walls, traditionally anything 50 years or longer is considered eligible for being historic. But as we had mentioned earlier, it's Mount Vernon. What is the highest precedence is anything available in George Washington's lifetime, so 1799 or prior. So even though that peach-colored 1950 plaster is technically an historic plaster, they would be much more willing to sacrifice that as opposed to the 1786 right next to it.
Again, we didn't design things or build the model out like we would if we were doing a regular design project. This is an example of a stair where we deconstructed the stair to every little piece of wood. They wanted to be able to track them separately because if they go to replace like a stair nosing trim, they want to know that that's not original to the building anymore. The handrail that you see there, for example, is actually original to the building. It's the very same handrail that George Washington would hold on to when he would go upstairs or downstairs. That's fairly significant to them. They want to know that all that assembly is original. And actually, as it turned out, while we were doing this project, they discovered that the very last spindle baluster in that handrail was actually missing completely. So they were able to replace it, and then we were able to identify it as, a modern intervention to the historic fabric. Okay, I'm going to hand this over now to Charles, and he's going to talk about the integration of GIS.
Thanks, Rob. So the model authoring software that we used for this, I think as we've already explained, is Revit. And Revit's a really powerful program, and it was really great to use if you know how to use it. If you don't, there's a fairly significant barrier to entry. And so our clients and a lot of other people we wouldn't expect to be using Revit as the sole source to access all of this information, because it would take not only a large monetary investment to get all the software, it would take a large amount of time to invest with people to learn how to use it properly, especially in the way, as Rob mentioned, we're not using it that you would for normal construction. This is very specialized use of it. And so because of that, we wanted to make sure that we took this model and all this information embedded within it outside into another resource that is more accessible, right? Going back to that first line, access to and use of. They need to be able to actually access this information. And so at this point in time, the best method that we could discover was actually bringing the Revit model into GIS, because in GIS we can now bring it into the global context, and we can also start integrating outside databases that organizations within Mount Vernon. There's collections, there is site, there's archaeology. All of these relative departments have their own independent databases where they use to collect information. So we could tie that back into elements that we have tagged with unique mark ID in the model. And so when we did this, basically we did something using a EFT, extraction, transformation, ETL, extraction, transformation, and loading tool. This is FME. And so we exported the Revit model out using IFC, Industry Foundation classes. And from then, we basically use this program to do visual coding. So we said, okay, I want everything that is marked with this unique identifier, because we know all the stair elements or all the roof rafters would be labeled in a certain way that we can discern what they are. And then we want to move them relatively into different buckets. And you can see at the bottom corner of this, they would take these relative buckets, then apply geometry back to them, and then we could load this into GIS. And what's important there is because within ArcGIS, we can then export it out to a web scene. What you can see here is a prototype we developed. And this, to be completely honest, is still relatively where we are to date in this process, because we can bring all the information to here, but it's really that integration of separate databases into the GIS on a web scene, which is proving to be quite difficult because it exists beyond what the skills you would typically find in the AEC community. And so we have this, we have the web scene that was developed, and the premise behind this was that you could basically have a web browser that your client could log into from anywhere in the world using any computer without having to access Revit, without having to access Esri, without having to access any unique software. And they can go through and start to filter what they wanted to see. And so we have the example that we showed earlier with the creation of the model, the different dates of installation for cluster. Well, now that's translated onto a resource you can find online. And with that, you can start associating photographs. You can start associating where in the archives they might have the document referencing where this plaster was created, where that document resides. And so using that, we wanted to make sure that all of the effort that we put into developing the model was then also used as a management system, because I think we skipped over it a little bit. When we talk about HBIM, a lot of people think it stands for Historic Building Information Model, and we always talk about the model. We show examples of the model because they're really cool, but what it really is, as we think about it, is Historic Building Information Management, right? It really goes beyond just the modeling process. It's about how do you take this resource and integrate it with other things that the client needs. And so that kind of wraps up the process of creating the HBIM to date. And so we are going to go talk about some lessons learned, some things we've learned along the way, what has changed as we've been doing this, and then we'll free up time for questions or discussions afterward. So with that, I will hand it back to Rob to go over the first lesson.
Nomenclature is ridiculously important, is what we discovered during this whole process. How you call something becomes really important. For example, when we were working on the Michigan State Capitol, we kept referring to the bottommost level of the building as the sub-basement. Well, the scanning company that we hired at the time kept referring to it as the crawl space. So we kept getting confused, thinking, wait, there's a crawl space? What about, but you didn't do the sub-basement. And for a couple of weeks there, we went back and forth, and they almost went out to do some more scanning before we realized, no, actually we're talking about the same space. So it's really important that everybody gets on board with how we name something. We've gone through and developed a rather detailed list of how the different elements get named. Everything has an abbreviation to it. Oftentimes the name will fit into that hierarchy where you want to know what room a particular element might be. Well, it's going to be included in the name of the room. Just like in normal architecture documentation, we might call out like door 101A belongs to room 101. We did a very similar thing here, but we did it with all the different elements within a room. And it went a little bit broader than just that. So the idea here is that we're trying to normalize that data so that it makes sense when it plugs into the database.
Well, and one thing too, using that, expanding upon that door example, as you might imagine, doors serve two rooms, they serve two areas. But in a place like Mount Vernon, and even in certain places in the Michigan State Capitol, they wanted to designate what that door, which room that door actually belonged in. So the way that we labeled it is whatever room it swung into is what it belonged to.
Yep.
And then the treatment, any sort of fenestration that was on the outside, that gets applied to whatever wall surface in which room it exists.
Right, so we actually had doors. Originally we were thinking, well, you'd model a door in Revit and it includes the door, the frame, and all the stuff around the frame. Well, it didn't actually work out that way because we needed to be able to show that the surround for the door on one side of the room looks one way, on the opposite room it looks completely different. And so the relationship is more with the room than with the door itself. So it was important that we structured the model and came up with the nomenclature to represent that as well.
Hey Charles, real quick, I'm just curious what you do when you have a door that swings both directions.
So yeah, in that case you would have to just, you pick one.
Yeah, basically you take whatever the highest priority. Basically, in a lot of ways, where you have in codes, whatever the most stringent code is what dictates what you have to do in terms of whatever the highest priority zone that the door is adjacent to, you would apply it to that.
So this is just an example of again, what Charles was showing with FME, where we have these elements. If they're not named correctly, the database doesn't recognize what they are because it looks at specific characters in the name to understand, oh, okay, this is a door, this is a window, this is a piece of flooring, so on and so forth. Okay, I'm going to hand it back to Charles. He's going to talk a little bit more about technology.
So actually, this is one of my favorite parts of this presentation because this slide, and the slide that I talked about that was very similar to this previously, completely irrelevant now. This existed when Autodesk and Esri were still siloed within their own respective kingdoms and did not have interoperability between the two of them. That has since changed since we started this process. Now you can actually bring native Revit files into ArcGIS and you can start reading it. So this brings up the important lesson number 2. Technology changes. Maybe things haven't felt like they've changed a lot in the past 2 years, but they've changed since we started this process. And so it's important to incorporate this into the process. Understand that just because you came up with a good idea at the time doesn't make it the best idea currently. And so there's always renovating, always innovation going back to how you can document and how you can associate information together. And so now I don't actually have to go through the FME program to bring it in. But that doesn't mean that I don't need to take lessons from what Rob just mentioned, nomenclature, because that mark ID is still extremely relevant. It's still just as relevant now as it was earlier. It's just now I don't have to use that as the primary way of converting the IFC geometry. Another example of technology to integrate. In the Michigan State Capitol, as we actually had about halfway to 3/4 through the project, one of the project managers mentioned the idea of orthophotography and photogrammetry. And because, as was mentioned previously, they have 9.5 acres of decorative paint, they wanted to be able to capture some of that in this model form. And if we're already going to go through the process of creating this digital database, why shouldn't photographs be incorporated into it? And so that's what we see here. We actually had a photographer come out and take extremely high resolution photographs. It might not look like it from the perspective here, but what you see on the top is the ceiling, and directly next to it is one of the medallion details on the ceiling. That ceiling is 18 feet in the air. I mean, the level of detail that you can see, the granularity and the brush strokes, you can't see that with the naked eye when you're in the room. But you have the photography capability of showing that. We should certainly add that into the HBIM management system, because that way you can go through and know when you have to do repairs that you have an idea of what already needs to occur before then.
And I'll add to that, we could also see hairline cracks in the plaster in the photographs. So over time, that can become really important to monitor the condition of the ceiling.
Yeah, absolutely. One lesson number 3 that we had learned, we're figuring out. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, but in that it basically lays out a series of rules on how you want to treat areas within a historic property that are designated with a certain importance. And so that includes restoration, adaptive reuse, authentic restoration, conservation, and rehabilitation. And these are the terms that the Michigan State Capitol was using. And so what we have shown in this plan here is a color coordination for anything that exists within that purple and pink, the areas 1 and 2, are of highest priority for them. And those are things that they want to make sure capture the historic nature, and any changes still reflect that historic nature. Any rooms or spaces that are found in areas 3 or 4, those are usually the more utilitarian, more operational spaces. Things where it doesn't actually matter if you save the plaster on that wall, because honestly it's about to get blown out when facilities managers come in for the next project. And if you remember the color scheme here, you can see how that translated into the model that we created. This model has LODs from 100 up to about 350. And so anything on that lower level, that basement, sub-basement crawl space, as Rob had mentioned, is in that orange. And it wasn't as big of a priority for the Michigan State Capitol because that space changes a lot. There's a lot of equipment moving through there. The floors get ripped up, the walls get ripped up. But if you go above that, we'll start to see the bluer spaces, such as the Senate and House chambers, where in those spaces we actually went through the process of detailing the capitals on top of the pilasters, the actual wainscoting, each chair rail, base rail, everything is an individual model element so they can track it. And so just making sure, keeping this in mind too, that you don't have to apply the same treatment with a broad brush, even within one facility. And with that, actually, there's a lesson number 4 that I don't think made it to the slide deck, but I think Rob can bring it up.
Basically, you have to learn to navigate bureaucracy within organizations. I think we all are familiar with that, but that has become particularly true on these projects because everybody has their own database within an organization, and they're very protective of it. And the reason why they have their own is because they don't trust anybody else to manage it. So when you come in and you say, hey, we've got this great system that's going to connect your database to everyone else's database, so you have this one single place to get your information, people start to, circle the wagons, and it becomes very difficult to get buy-in. So it's really important that you have a champion that has some influence on your clients. And I'll also add another couple of lessons learned. Relationships with software vendors was really key here because we were trying to really push what the software was intended to do. We were kind of making it up as we were going along. We did some research early on. We didn't find any examples of anybody doing anything like this with one exception, and it was a grad student at an Italian university that was talked about HBIM for cataloging, I think it was masonry, in a stone wall. That was all we had to go off of, and it was a very specific use case that they were referring to. I think since then there have been some other folks that have pushed the envelope. What we've talked about today is just how our journey along this, since we started it about, Charles said it was 9 years ago. It was in 2013 when we were first approached to do this. And then another lesson learned is it needs to be simple. If it's overly complicated, nobody's going to deal with it. We don't budget time in our lives to do cross all the I's and cross the T's, dot the I's. That might be required, even of the system like what we had talked about. It was great to come up with the method of what we call our personal level of development, where we talked about the location, shape, and material accuracy of the modeled element. But now you have to go back and actually apply that value to every single element in the model. And as you saw, we had a lot of elements in that model, far more than what you might find in a typical model. If it's done for something like construction. So those are some more lessons learned, I guess, if you want to add to any of that, Charles.
Yeah, no, that's, I think that's good too. And then also, just making sure this is adaptable. I mean, as Rob mentioned before, the different bureaucracies and different agencies, they all have different requirements for how to handle data, what you can do with it, be flexible in how you can actually deliver some of this data. One of the agencies we worked with was really interested in, even if we can go from Revit to GIS, they still found that transition through IFC very critical because being open source, IFC isn't dependent upon a particular software vendor. And so, sometimes in the process of making this, we have extra steps that we have to do that are just kind of one-off shoots. But they really wanted those IFC files because they wanted to know that 10, 15 years, if Revit is no longer the industry standard, they can still access it without having to go back and buy an archived legacy version of the software. But with that, for the last few minutes about questions. Rob and I can talk about this stuff probably longer than you'll have time for, so don't be afraid to answer.
So, Ken Van Bury from the Imagery Committee here at USIBD. The pictures that you show are great. I can imagine those being printed out and submitted to the National Archives and be around 500 years from now. But what about the digital data? How are you turning that over? And how can we ensure that that's going to be available 100 years from now when people want to come back and do some work?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. To be perfectly frank, when we started this, we weren't so concerned and probably didn't have an awareness of the fragility of digital data over long periods of time. We were more trying to focus on how do we even establish the system. Originally we were looking at things like Bluebeam. Because Bluebeam supports 3D models, and we thought, oh, maybe we could do something with that. We called them, talked to them about it, and they were, it didn't work. We worked with Autodesk as well. They weren't really interested in working directly with us. We reached out to Esri. They were. And so that's actually where I think that's where the data will reside. It turns out Esri, the geodatabase, really becomes the central hub of where all the information goes. And it also will connect out to other databases. But the primary database is actually a geodatabase. So Revit is where the content gets created, and then it gets imported into the geodatabase, and that's essentially where it will live. But how that 50, 100 years from now, 500 years from now, how does that data maintain its integrity? I don't have an answer for that right now. I don't know that anyone does, really.
I agree, nobody has that answer now, but I think it's one that we need to think about in terms of USIBD. Let's help drive standards in that area where we can know that the data that we've created will be useful in the future.
I have a question regarding the model itself. You mentioned that you had a range of level of details starting from 100 to 350. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, when you get to those higher level of details, and you mentioned that you had to model the capitals of certain columns, how accurate can you represent the geometry given the restrictions and constraints of the authoring tool like Revit?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and to give an honest answer, it's as accurate as the software will let us, and we try to convey that in the designation that we had talked about previously, the LOD that we had developed at first with Mount Vernon, before we were aware of LOA, and before, because we knew that the LOD designation didn't serve the purposes that we were trying to achieve. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because Revit in general does some geometries really well and some really poorly. And we ran into experiences like modeling ceilings versus floors. For whatever reason, at the time, floors, you were able to add sub points, and you can actually add deviations and dips and divots, but we didn't have the same thing for a ceiling. And so even within a respective LOD 300 space, it was sort of a majority, whatever the majority of the elements were designated as, designated that space. But there were certainly some that were slightly less than that 300 threshold, just because we frankly couldn't get there yet.
And just to clarify too, the LOD that we developed is not at all analogous to what the AIA's LOD is. So for us, it was each digit represents something different. So the first digit would represent how accurately was it. It was either shape or location. I can't remember which. Go to that slide here in a sec. But the first digit would be a ranking of like the location of the object. The second digit would grade the shape, how accurately it was shaped of the object itself is, and then the third refers to the material qualities of it. So yeah, that's basically what we wound up doing. And there were definitely times where, like for example, with the ceilings, if a ceiling is sagging, or what I would do is I would model it according to how it looked projected in plan. So there were definitely times where when you look at the model in 3D, you'll see two ceiling surfaces that should align, but they don't, and that's just a product of the limitations of working in Revit. So yeah, we just had to sort of deal with it that way. And we always said we can always refer back to the point cloud. If it became really critical to understand where that ceiling was, like is it continuing to sag over time? Well, then you would look at the point cloud and compare it to a more recent scan or something like that.
Thank you. And I have another question regarding, I think there was a slide with those photos of ceilings.
Yep.
I'm curious, it looked like those images were mapped onto the model, or
They-
laid on the model.
They were. Yeah, these images were converted into OBJ files, and they were brought in as individual elements that were mapped onto the surface.
Okay. I was curious, how did you map those onto the walls? Because it looks pretty cool.
Yeah, it took a while, and also, this is another limitation of the software. It looks really, really cool for that snapshot. It takes about 15 minutes for the model to load in order to take that snapshot, because once you have the images shown, it's a lot of processing power. But yeah, essentially these photographs were converted into object files independently, and then those were brought in as families that were then placed onto the surface.
Yes.
So this was basically a proof of concept to see if it was even possible to do it. We decided it is possible, but it's not practical. Is ultimately where we landed with that.
And I have a follow-up question to that. Given this process, do you think that photorealistic mesh models have any use in HBIM?
Definitely.
What would that look like?
So that's not something that we've yet had the chance to explore in depth. We've talked a little bit about it, but I think that in combination with the model itself can start to become, I like to think of all these sort of serve a purpose, right? So it's okay to have maybe a dumb version of the model plus, well, I say dumb, compared to a mesh is going to graphically show what actually the surfaces look like, but the model elements themselves may better display the actual shape of the object. And also you can then attach detail, like data to it as well. Whether or not we can do that with a mesh, meshes are primarily surfaces, not solids, so there's not really it's not so much of an object to be hosting data, in my opinion. I could be wrong about that, but I do think those meshes would make something like this, which is not practical. This is doable, but not practical. I think a mesh would make this practical.
Thank you.
Yeah, and one quick thing to add is the idea of whenever we begin a project and we have our BIM execution plan, the very first things we talk about is what are the use goals? What do you want to get out of this model? And yeah, if it's just to convey finish information and really just to show what the space looks like, and you don't actually need to have the capability of tagging each individual element, yeah, mesh is absolutely a better way to go. And there's no need to spend all the time developing the independent architectural elements because that's not what they need.
Do you guys think at some point we could get to a point where this is almost required for historical designation? Maybe not a high-level BIM model that you have, but even scanning. If you want to be designated as a historical or a heritage site, it's required to go and have that building scanned just so you have it for posterity's sake. I think Notre Dame was a perfect example of that had been scanned. But do you think there's any future in that?
Yes, actually, some of our conversations on the Heritage Committee have talked about So I view what we did at Mount Vernon as sort of like the most extreme, you know, like where they literally are tracking the locations of nails that hold down the floorboards. That's absurd, but it's useful for them. Actually, they were able, this is kind of a crazy story, in anybody's memory, they've always assumed that those floorboards were replaced back in the 1850s. And then just as we were working on the project, just before, the year before, they restored that new room. Back in 2013, they restored it. They discovered, as they were pulling up the floorboards, that the floorboards were actually 26 feet long, each board. There were no seams as you went across, right? That seemed interesting to them, that you could even get a piece of wood that long. So they did some more research on it, and they discovered, sure enough, that was actually something that Washington made a big stink about back when the room was being developed, that he wanted boards that were that long, and the contractor at the time, the guy that was actually not contractor, tradesman, the craftsman was having a hell of a time trying to find a piece of wood that was that long. So there was actually some documentation about it. And they discovered, basically in 2013, that everyone assumed that those boards were from the 1850s. They're not. They're actually original to the building from 1785. So, sorry, I feel like that was a bit of a ramble.
That was an interesting fact.
So So back to your original question: Do I think that this could become part of like a certification or something? So, or standard practice for historic buildings? We have talked about trying to simplify that so that you don't have to go to the nth degree like we did at Mount Vernon, and instead it could just be something as simple as, well, you need to be able to at least capture point cloud of the building and maybe do some really basic historic analysis of it. As to what degree that is, I'd leave that up to the preservationists, but I'm more the technology guy. But
yeah, well, in terms of legislation for requiring things like that, that's going to be a bit of a hurdle, just because all legislation is a bit of a hurdle. But things like, well, there's a couple things important to keep in mind. One, if the owner themselves have to be pretty invested in doing what's right for stewardship for these spaces, and often the people that we work with, of course, are. Why would they hire people like us if they weren't interested? But things like HABs and HAIR, if you're familiar with that, the Historic American Building Survey and Historic American Engineering Record, they started during like the TWA time, Works Progress, as a way to employ architects and engineers who didn't have employment otherwise. Basically, they went through the country at the time and started surveying historic properties and making highly detailed drawings at the time to keep as a record, and they're actually housed within the Library of Congress. You can search them. In fact, if you look up Library of Congress HABs, HABS, you'll find a whole list of things you can search. But that's what it's run out of the Park Service now. They're starting to incorporate things like laser scans, and they're actually, one of the projects I'd worked on previously last year was updating a HABs drawing that was done in the 1950s. And so, yeah, there's already certain agencies, federal agencies at least, that are looking into incorporating newer, more sophisticated surveying methods. And I think to be on the National Register of Historic Places, there is a certain level of, there's a written documentation, but there's also a certain level of physical drawing documentation that you have to provide.
So I just wanted to make a comment about the use of meshes, because I think that could be a really good sort of next step for this. I think we'll see some of the model authoring programs start to incorporate and integrate with and able to use that data more. What we've found, or where we've had success, is taking the meshes and sort of separating them. In our case, usually it's by system, where we can sort of segregate the mesh into the systems that, say, grab all the HVAC, for example. For our purpose, that's more for things like coordination with the existing, stuff that's there, where we can add the design. In this case, I could see, segmenting
an object and then being able to add data to it in the same way that you guys are using Revit. So really something to look into and probably a great next evolution for this stuff.
So just to add a couple more ideas to what Josh just said, Paul Alban and a couple of guys worked. We went to Italy to do some surveying of a theater in 2016, and we were trying to incorporate meshes into Revit. So he found a pretty good way of simplifying the mesh in 3D Max and actually incorporating it into a family. So you get all the details. So for instance, you have a column capital. You use photogrammetry, whatever, to create the mesh, and then you simplify it. So it performs inside the model, and just bring it, and then you can add all that data to it. But again, you need to segment it, and there are tools like I think ZBrush that will help you to have a watertight mesh and just have like a hybrid type of representation.
That sounds really interesting, actually.
Well, as long as we're talking about wild ideas, I look at this ceiling and I see a JPEG photograph. But if you add to that the location of various points in it, you can actually store that in the JPEG. So why not let's push some of the measurement data into the JPEG. What you get is a flat image, but if you need to know the actual locations of things, you can pick it out of that, because it seems to me that putting a fine mesh on there and mixing up pictures from a lot of different cameras, that's going to add a lot of data to it that's really not necessary, and JPEG's already a standard, so why don't we put it there?
That's fascinating. The trick now is to just find someone who's willing to fund that project where we can start to dive into some more of these technologies. I don't know if there was one more question over on the gentleman in the blue shirt over there had a question, I think, earlier. I don't know if you. You're good. Good. All right. Well, I think we're pretty close to time.
We're getting at time here. I think we'll call it a session, but I'd like to also encourage anyone that is interested in getting involved in the Heritage Committee. Rob and Charles are the guys to talk to. We certainly welcome any involvement on that committee. It's there's going to be some really cool things coming out of it. So, and probably some cross-committee collaboration with Ken over here on the imagery side too. So, great presentation, guys. How about a round of applause?